um, affordable housing and creating generational wealth is a big part of reparations. And there's a lot of new developments, housing developments happening here in St. Paul. So we have Ben Werner here, and he's been working on housing justice for the last couple of years here in St. Paul. So he's going to start us out off with a presentation, and then I'll follow back up with some information about where some of the things that we want to see happen also as it pertains to housing for the American descendants of slavery here in St. Paul. Ben, so I'd like to introduce and let Ben take it from here.
Thanks, Trahern. Clarence, do you want to say a couple words about the library before we get started?
Sure. Thanks everyone for joining us here at the Eastside Freedom Library. As some of you know, for the past couple of years, we've had many events and conversations around the issue of housing justice. So this is just one and another, and we'll have another similar to this on the 23rd of March. But we appreciate that you're here. The library is a place where we cultivate and curate not just events, but conversations between neighbors and people in far off places who need to hear what each other says and to share their stories with each other. You can see our events page on our website at eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. You can see many of these things on Facebook. We have a Facebook page and an Instagram page and a Twitter page as well. But I just wanted to welcome everyone, and thanks for being a part of this conversation. With that, I will hand it over to Ben, and he can lead us into this session.
I muted myself. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here for a moment. I have a presentation, and Trahern's going to go into his piece. I'm going to do some breakout rooms, and then we're going to come back together and talk. So give me just one moment here. Okay, can you all see that? Yep, okay, wonderful. So once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is a presentation about the Hillcrest golf course site redevelopment. It's a very large development happening here on the east side, and so we decided that we wanted to hold a community meeting about it. Here's tonight's agenda. We're going to be doing, I'm going to go over the Hillcrest golf course development. I want to talk about its history and the city's planning process with the site. I also want to then pass it over to Trahern to talk about reparations and wealth building and land in this realm. Like I said, we're going to do breakout groups, and then we're going to share back. Just some housekeeping notes. Please be respectful of others and share the space. Feel free to use the chat to ask questions or share comments. We are going to record tonight's event to share with others, but we're not going to record any small group discussions, so those will be entirely private. So who am I, and why is the Eastside Freedom Library hosting this conversation? So like I said at the beginning, my name is Ben Werner. I'm the Housing Justice Program Director here at the Eastside Freedom Library. We decided to host this conversation because reparations are a really big part of housing justice, and when we look at a really big development like this, it's important to examine it from a housing justice angle, but also a reparations angle. And so we thought this was a healthy place to bring some democracy into the conversation. I'll talk about our history in brief, but really at the end of the day, we're hosting this conversation to bring education to the community. We believe in community building and democracy as part of our mission. You know, part of my job as the Housing Justice Program Director is to keep my ear to the ground, to bring information to the community and reduce a lot of the barriers to understand what's going on. We're here to help educate, not only about ongoing events, but also the way that our city, Port Authority, community developers go about creating new developments. There are other developments coming up in the future on the east side, so it's important that we come together and learn about the process and get involved. We think that if there isn't consciousness and intentionality about the way that we host these conversations and engage in the process of these developments, that we're going to get the same consequences that the system has kind of generated in the past. So I want to talk about our history just for a moment. Our history goes back a couple years now at this point. We hosted an initial conversation about the racial housing gap in Minnesota. This was a program that came together between ABC Realty and Eastside Freedom Library. We were also joined by the Metropolitan Interfaith Coalition on Affordable Housing and Dayton's Bluff Neighborhood Housing Services. I was working with Sienna at the time, and we were examining this huge gap in ownership between people of color and white Minnesotans. So we hosted this initial event, and it really was successful. In the middle of a snowstorm, a lot of folks came out. We followed that up with a labor panel discussion, which led into us partnering with Twin Cities Public Television to show a series of films, starting with Sold Out, Jim Crow of the North, Detroit 48202, just to provoke conversations about housing justice in our community and what that looks like and what's going on the East Side. It all kind of came together in our first East Side Housing Summit 2 years ago in November. I was really excited that we had a second East Side Housing Summit this last December. Some of you may have attended that. We're looking forward to the third one towards the end of this year. But consistently throughout this process, we heard from the community that there needed to be a call for action, or that there needed to be something that we were doing here as a library, as a convener. And so we created the Housing Justice Program in September of this last year, and we started to pursue and explore options for addressing some of the systemic inequities on the East Side, especially as it pertains to housing justice. So what does the Hillcrest Golf Course have to do with our mission? Well, like I was saying, we are exploring and implementing values-based strategies to address the historic and systemic inequities in housing on the East Side. We view ourselves really as an incubator of change, and one of our priorities has been to figure out different methods that we can bring about solutions for the historic and systemic inequities in our community. So one of the strategies that we've been exploring and that we hope to adopt with the assistance of the district councils and the city is a tool called the Equitable Development Scorecard. The scorecard is a really wonderful tool that allows communities to score incoming development to determine how equitably it will serve the community. It's a really powerful tool because traditionally, we see developers working to purchase a piece of land and then develop it and maybe engage with the community during the process. And this really requires developers to go to the community and talk to them and design it together. So it's a great way to prevent what Frogtown Neighborhood Association calls development without displacement, and to make sure that really we're serving the communities. So we've been exploring this tool, learning how it works. Hillcrest Golf Course may be a little bit too far along to implement this tool, but we think that with the future developments on the East Side, that this is really a powerful tool we can use to make sure that development occurring on the East Side serves the community. I also want to mention that it's important that we take this lens of reparations, especially with the new commission exploring reparations in the city of St. Paul. I'm going to let Trahern go into that a lot more because that's his specialty. But I think that's an important angle to look at when we're talking about these major new developments, which can create a lot of housing and jobs and wealth for our community. I also want to mention that it's important to examine major developments like this from an Indigenous perspective too. That's not something that we're going into tonight, but I think it's really important in the future that we host events focused on Indigenous land use, especially around this kind of development and how we can work together. So hopefully in the future, we'll have some more programming from an Indigenous perspective on larger developments like this, but also smaller developments as well. I also want to mention that the Port Authority had offered to speak about their process in all of this as well. That was exciting for me to see, and definitely we will plan on partnering with the Port Authority to host an event in the future so that you can understand a little bit more about how they engage with all of this as well. So what is the Hillcrest development? Well, the Hillcrest development is a 112-acre former golf course on the East Side in the greater East Side neighborhood. The site is now owned by the Port Authority. And it's being developed by the city of St. Paul, and has been since 2019 and is in the process right now. So why does the Port Authority own the site? I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and talk about the soil contamination on the site. All of this information in the entire presentation can be found on the Port Authority's website or the city's own Hillcrest website. So you can go take a look at it a little bit more in depth after the presentation. So the history of the Hillcrest Golf Course. In 1921, the Hillcrest Golf Course opened. For some years, it was just operating with the general public. Of course, it was a club, so you had to be part of the club. In 1945, a group of Jewish businessmen approached the site and purchased it, and then it became a Jewish-only golf club on the east side of St. Paul. Now, the reason they did this was because at the time, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and so Jews were excluded from playing golf in a lot of the other golf clubs throughout the Twin Cities. And so they purchased this, and it became a Jewish-only club. In the 1970s, the site opened to the public, and it operated for another 40 or so years. During that time, financially, there were some ups and downs with the golf course. In 2011, the company running the course ended up filing for bankruptcy, and the site was acquired by the Steam Fitters and Pipe Fitters Local 455 union. Originally, that union had a vision of creating a training center on the site, but after 3 years, they decided not to do that. So then between 2014 and 2018, the union tried to sell the site, but struggled, which led them into negotiations with the Port Authority. And I'll talk a little bit more about why they were struggling with that in just a moment. So they entered into negotiations with the Port Authority, and the Port Authority commissioned a market study, found that there was a significant demand for owner-occupied and rental affordable housing, as well as a new business park. The Port Authority has a mission of developing industrial sites throughout the Twin Cities, so this was a great opportunity to create a lot of housing and jobs. The Port Authority bought the site for $10 million using bonds from the city, and has now partnered with the city to develop the site. So going back to that previous question, why was it hard to sell the site in the first place? It's a really big piece of land, and it's very desirable, right? It's a huge piece of land in St. Paul. So what was so difficult about it? Well, the answer, I think, is there are a few different factors, but I think one of the major factors that made it difficult to sell this site is that the soil is contaminated. So how is the soil contaminated? When it was in service as a golf course, they were using fungicide to kill mushrooms in the golf course. And it wasn't the good kind of mercury, unfortunately. So the site is contaminated with mercury from the fungicide. It's also contaminated with some petroleum products. So I'm not exactly sure what those were, but there were petroleum products used on the golf course, and it's almost a 100-year history. So luckily, the Port Authority had an environmental study done on the site, and it's only really the top 36 inches of the site that are contaminated. But it still makes it difficult to sell such a site. Luckily, the Port Authority has a very long history redeveloping a brownfield like this. And so it was a perfect opportunity for them to get involved with rehabilitating the site and working with the city. So on August 8th, 2019, the city of St. Paul formally agreed to take on the master planning process and announced it. So what that means is that although the site is owned by the Port Authority, the city of St. Paul is the one who's creating a master plan for the entire site. So figuring out what the housing will look like, figuring out the jobs, creating a site map for the development, and kind of zoning everything as well. So from August 8th to September 6th, applications were taken for a community advisory committee to provide feedback on the plans for the site, and a technical advisory committee was also created. During that time, approximately 70 people applied for the community advisory committee, and the mayor appointed the members. So who is on the community advisory committee? So I think that's important because you know, it was an appointed position from applications. So I just wanted to break it down really easily here. So there's 3 St. Paul residents, 3 Maplewood residents, a planning commissioner, a housing representative, a business representative, a District 2 representative, and a transportation representative. So the city hired a consulting firm to lead the community engagement work. On February 15th, the city held its first forum for the plan. There were approximately 230 to 200 or 220 to 230 engagements for the site. About 160 of those engagements were at a community forum, 22 were through online surveys, and 48 were during 3 pop-up events. The engagements led to a draft of 20 community priorities, which was later discussed and voted into place at the next Community Advisory Committee meeting. That draft of 20 community priorities was to shape the plans that the city would put forth. It should be noted that although the pop-up events engaged with a more diverse range of residents, both the community forum and the surveys had engagements from primarily an older white demographic of residents. Now, I don't want to go through all 20 of these priorities, but I think it's important that you know what they are, so we're going to mail them out. So the city also created kind of policy and technical priorities highlights. Now, this came between the Community Advisory Committee and the technical committee. So roughly the goals for the site were to create around 1,000 jobs. They're also to create around 1,000 households. It was also to create 20 acres of parks, trails, and open spaces, and to create activity through kind of a mixed use. I want to be a little more specific about that last point. So what that means is that they want to create neighborhood nodes. And what those are compact mixed use areas. So they usually have shops, services, and neighborhood scale civic and institutional uses, recreational facilities, and some jobs. So here are the 4 plans. These are 4 draft plans that were created by Cunningham Group, which was a consultant that the city hired to do a lot of the landscape design, kind of urban planning site plan for this, but also St. Paul Planning and Economic Development. There were 4 initial approaches. So there was a light touch approach, which would kind of involve the least hands-on approach. There was a conservation approach. And then there was a reshaping approach and a sculpting approach. Now, looking at this map is not really clear what that is. So I wanted to explain that for a second. So just broken down to be really simple, the pink area is the sort of mixed use light industrial. The yellow, orange, and red are different types of housing at different kind of varying rates of density, going from single family housing all the way to kind of high density housing. The shades of green are different types of parks or wetlands as well as trails. So you can see that each of these 4 approaches is quite different and provides very different types of housing, different amounts of jobs, as well as different amounts of green space. I'm going to pause there and take a look at the chat just so I can make sure to answer any questions. Okay, great. I'm going to keep going. So after these 4 plans were created, they were presented to the Community Advisory Committee, and they kind of worked through them and then revised them. Currently, there are 2 final plans that were presented. One is called the hilltop approach, and you can see on the left hand that there's a certain amount of jobs and households that will be added to the site with this plan. It also demonstrates the density of the housing types with kind of fewer single family homes, more medium density and higher density units. You can see on the right here that this plan is called that because it preserves one of the major hilltops at the Hillcrest golf course site. It also preserves a lot of the wetlands, which are kind of the teal color you're seeing on the right there. there's actually a description for this plan, which I'm going to read to you now, and it's from the city's presentation on this. So the hilltop concept preserves the site's unique topographic feature and provides an active park to its northwest. A green buffer is provided along the western edge. It provides fewer jobs and more housing units. It is projected to need more development subsidy due to the amount of open space and less optimal industrial placement for market viability. And it removes the most ecologically significant wetland. The next revised plan that they proposed is a jobs-focused version. So now you can see that the jobs and households are kind of more evenly matched. There are more single-family homes with this plan, more medium density and fewer high-density homes. You can see that the wetlands were pretty actively moved and the larger areas for light industrial. So their description says this concept provides the most jobs and an active park in the northeast adjacent to the most ecologically significant wetland. It provides fewer housing units. It extends the street grid and residential uses from the west. It's projected to need less or no development subsidy due to the amount of open space and more optimal industrial placement for market viability. But it removes the hilltop feature. So here's the timeline to completion. There will be a final recommended master plan with a single site. Oh, sorry, whoops. There we go. There will be a final recommended master plan with a single site concept, which will be forwarded to the Planning Commission and the City Council in early 2021 for formal public hearings. After the master plan is adopted, they'll start planning and doing environmental remediation, which will be necessary prior to above ground development. So infrastructure work could begin in late 2021. We're going to go over this again before we let everybody go today, but the city is going to hold a public engagement session next week on Tuesday the 16th from 5:30 to 7. It's really important that we attend that meeting because that's the opportunity for us to weigh in on these plans. We are also going to host our own follow-up conversation to tonight's conversation, as well as the city session 2 weeks from now on Tuesday the 23rd from 6:30 to 8. We haven't set a clear agenda for that meeting yet because we want it to be an opportunity for folks to just hold space and community and talk to each other. We're going to be hosting the breakout groups later tonight, and during those, there will be a number of prompt questions that we might base the next conversation on. This presentation, as well as the key dates and the community priorities, will be emailed out to you after this. So these are the questions I will do in the breakout room after Traherne has a chance to speak, and I'll drop those in the chat again. But just so you know, what did you hear, what was missing, and what questions do you have? And then please appoint someone to share back from your group. I put my contact information here. This will be in the presentation, of course, too. But if you have any questions about what the Housing Justice Program is doing right now, you can either give me a call at 612-986-7390, or you can shoot me an email at ben@eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. You can also follow us on Facebook at Eastside Freedom Library or the Eastside Housing Justice Group. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Traherne.
Thanks, Ben. And that was great information and a great presentation. So we've been talking about, part of talking about reparations is talking about the racial wealth gap and building generational wealth. The Rondo community was a thriving Black community here in St. Paul that was damaged because of the I-94 freeway that ran through a community that had Black businesses and Black housing. So on January 13th, the city of St. Paul passed a resolution that apologized for Dred Scott being in military slavery at Fort Snelling, and it also gave an apology for the destruction of the Rondo community via the I-94 freeway. And because of things like that, what happened in Rondo, what happened in Rosewood, what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, these things contribute to the racial wealth gap and denying African Americans of intergenerational or generational wealth. Some quick numbers real quick, just data for the median household income by race in America would be for post-college, for whites is 455,000. For blacks, it's 141,000. For college, it's $268,000. For whites, for blacks, it's 70,000. Some college, 135,000 for whites, 18,000 for blacks. High school, 118,000 for whites, 6,600 for blacks. Less than high school, 82,000 for whites, 27,000 for blacks. So to start addressing this, one thing, these are things that are set in stone, but when the Legislative Advisory Committee starts, these are things that I would be advocating for. NARC has a 10-point program that I really think is really good, and it talks about creating affordable housing for healthy Black communities and wealth generation. Historically, people of African descent were denied equitable access to programs within agencies like the Federal Housing Administration, which white Americans utilized to create prosperous suburbs across the nation and create wealth that could be transferred intergenerationally. Blacks were often victimized by discriminatory covenants that restricted them to certain neighborhoods, redlining by banks, which refused to make loans to individuals and businesses in targeted neighborhoods. Most recently, subprime lending schemes, which resulted in the loss of billions of dollars in wealth in the form of home equity. The persistence of these discriminatory policies and practices produced an intergenerational deficit in terms of wealth creation that has stunted the social and economic development in Black families and communities. Therefore, we demand the funding of an African American Housing and Finance Authority to finance the planning and construction of holistic and sustainable villages with affordable housing and comprehensive cultural, educational, health, and wellness employments and economic services, function as a source of grants and loans for persons seeking affordable housing. So we spoke about it a little bit earlier here, and just real quick with this conversation and what we're talking about tonight, I think we're talking about two issues. We're talking about housing, but we're also talking about businesses. And with reparations, we're talking about Black businesses. So when you're talking about development, that means that something has to be developed. And if something has to be developed, that means that it's going to cost some money, and that it's going to create jobs, and it's going to create, a lot of times these developments create generational wealth for the companies who are doing the work. So I believe in Milwaukee, and I know St. Paul used to do it, but it says each year millions of dollars and this is from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, each year millions of dollars in contracts are awarded by the city of Milwaukee. From major construction projects to office supplies, and every year businesses owned by Blacks, Hispanics, and other underrepresented groups, including women, compete for those city dollars. Now, a long simmering debate over whether the city's process for awarding contracts is equitable for those businesses may be coming to a head through a new study that is examining the city's contracting system. The city's process for awarding contracts has long been race neutral, which means race and gender cannot be used by the city as it awards contracts. In comparison, Milwaukee's county Targeted Business Enterprise Program and State of Wisconsin's Disadvantaged Business Enterprise DBE certification program for departments and transportation projects have race-based participation requirements, which mean they are race conscious. Race and gender can be considered when awarding those contracts. So I think when we're talking about, and I'm not sure where the city of St. Paul is on this yet, but I know when we're talking about building developments, especially like these that, and we're talking about reparations, we want to make sure that a certain number of Black businesses are a part of building multi-million-dollar projects. And so that we can start creating generational wealth through our businesses for our families and communities also. And with, so one thing that happened with, just to go back to tell you, the St. Paul Recovery Act, when we first started the St. Paul Recovery Act, I I was elected to be the chair of the Green Party of the United States Reparations Working Group. After that, I started doing workshops here in St. Paul, and I was honored and lucky enough to have Miss Prince came and attended one of those workshops. Then a few months after that, I believe Evanston, Illinois passed their reparations initiative. And then I think Ms. Prince seen it, and then we met and talked about it. And then that's when we decided that we would start this reparations book club meeting, which is what we're on right now. And then simultaneously, we started a couple months later, we started the steering committee that did the work of writing the resolution and community outreach to get people on board with the ideal. And then we met with the city council and got the resolution passed. But Evanston, Illinois was the first city in America to pass a reparations resolution. The city of St. Paul is the biggest city in America so far to pass a resolution. So this is from Revolt TV, and it has a picture from a rally that we threw a couple of weeks ago in Washington, D.C. So I was kind of excited about that. And it says, according to ABC News, Evanston, Illinois is the first city in the country to pass the monumental legislation providing reparations for Black people. The $10 million plan was passed nearly 2 years ago, and it includes incremental payments up to $25,000 specifically allocated for housing purposes. Black residents and their kin that lived in Evanston during the redlining will be the only applicants qualified for the funds. The city is using 3% tax on legal marijuana sales to finance reparations. At the helm of Evanston's groundbreaking initiative is Fifth Ward Alderman Robin Rule Simmons. The only legislative response for us to reconcile the damages in the Black community is reparations, Rule Simmons said. I was looking at the data. I was looking at what we had done. What more could we do? And reparations was the only answer. The ramifications of redlining in the Evanston community during the 1940s continued for decades. As Black families were consistently denied loans for housing by banks, the article states the discriminatory practice in the city's Black population away from white families in the Fifth Ward. The historic redlining impacts our community today, Bruce Simmons said. The map still is the map of our concentrated Black community, our disinvestment, and our inferior infrastructure. So those are just some things that I think that we can start working on here as far as making sure that, and so what I was reading, Ms. Dickinson, was this article came out yesterday, and that's in Revolt, from Revolt TV, and it's Evanston, Illinois will begin distributing reparations to Black residents. I'll try to get it in the chat. And then the other one is an article about equitable contract dealing in Milwaukee, and I think that's in the Milwaukee Courier. And that's what I wanted to, and I could leave it there, and if anybody has any questions.
Thanks, Rahern. I think at this point we should go into breakout groups. It's 7:10 right now. Let's go into breakout groups for about half an hour, and then we'll come back. I am going to share my screen just briefly here again so that you can see the questions that we'd like you to discuss, but take it wherever you want to go. So give me just a moment here. All right, so in the breakout rooms, what did you hear? What was missing? What questions do you have? And I'll also drop that in the chat. Okay, so we're going to split into about 5 different breakout rooms, and I'll call everybody back in just under half an hour. All right, here we go. We're back. Well, thank you so much for jumping into those groups. Let's do some callback. Keep in mind that I'm gonna take some notes about what you all want to see at the next meeting that we'll host on the 23rd. So if the person you appointed doesn't bring that up, feel free to jump in and let me know. So how about group 1?
I'm not sure. I think I was in group 1. So I'll take that if that's
You
okay.
were, Jean. Thanks.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. I couldn't remember. Okay, so I would say we talked primarily about 5 things. So I'm going to run through those. One of the things that we got pretty excited about was the idea of an all-electric community, fossil fuels, but solar and wind energy and so forth, so that we had a really green community there. It would certainly be the first such development, I think, in the Midwest, possibly at one time. I've even heard of the first in the United States, and we thought that would be really cool and really a draw. The other big thing we talked about quite a while was home ownership and how to help people get into that position, to find some help to do that. Then we talked a bit about diversity too. For example, the construction that would be going on as this community was developed. We wanted to make sure that those contracts reflected the diversity in our neighborhoods already, and that they were equitable, good jobs. And we're also a little bit concerned about what, Ben, you said about getting responses. It seemed like it was primarily coming from older white people, which we had a couple of, yeah, but we really thought it would be great to get more diverse responses to that. Even at this point, there's a little bit of feeling that maybe some people had not known as much about this as they should have. Yep. And the last thing we just questioned was why Maplewood had as many representatives as St. Paul, when it seems like Hillcrest is entirely in St. Paul. So those were the things we talked about. Any questions on those? Or
Sounds great. How about group 2?
okay.
Well, group 2, we're going to have Anne be our spokesperson, but she was having, Anne DeJoy, but she was having problems with her internet. I think she said that she logged on about 3 times and or lost her connection about 3 or 4 times anyway. But I think, I mean, essentially what we were doing, we were asking Anne a lot of questions on where the master plan is. Yeah, they've had a number of meetings. Obviously, they've had to go to Zoom. I think the March meeting was even postponed for whatever reason. So I think a lot of the questions were really on timelines, which was somewhat related to, can essentially community members still have a voice, in the process? So in other words, is this too far along to have a voice or not? I don't know that we necessarily answered that question. Anne said that probably instead of early 2021, which is just about over with, it would probably be more of an August timeline in terms of when the master plan would be presented. And a little bit what Jean was talking about, it sounds like there's a lot of pushback from Maplewood neighbors that, I don't know if it's a NIMBY thing or exactly what the concern is, but they're definitely, seem to be, pushing back. And, there's some executive homes, I think, to the south that, they're concerned about overdevelopment anyway. But that, I mean, that's essentially what we had, was just, you know, kind of where this process is at, how we could add, you know, equity to the process. And then, you know, again, is there enough time to do it? You know, I suppose the other possibility is that, you know, is there, if there doesn't appear to be enough time and those voices haven't been heard, is there some way to, you know, not to, you know, not to stalemate the process, but at least, you know, slow it down and make sure those voices are heard anyway. I don't know if any other, and there were certainly environmental questions too. I know Katie was on the call. I don't know if you needed, if there anything you'd like to add, or what your thoughts were. Okay.
Just one thing, there is a
There's Ann.
there is a community engagement event that Ben's going to talk about later. That's an opportunity to bring forth any of your questions. And there will be public hearings on the master plan once it starts, you know, getting to the end of, you know, there'll be public hearings, and then they'll go back and make revisions and that kind of stuff. So there is additional opportunity to have input.
Yep. And again, in case people jump off, that next community engagement is on the 16th. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I'll put the slide up one more time too.
Yep.
How about group 3?
I don't know what group we were, but I can go next if that's okay. So we had kind of like the other Gene on the call here, 5 things to talk about, I guess. One was, we talked about affordable housing versus appropriate housing. Appropriate meaning size. Are we thinking of housing for large families, several bedrooms, and big enough and affordable enough for people who need to have that size? And then what types of buildings would surround that? Is community centers, you know, gathering spaces for people who need that for their traditional things. Then we talked about the price. We spent some time talking about the price of new construction. You know, we talked about the large enough houses, but yet how much is that going to cost, and is that going to outprice the neighborhood or outprice the people looking for houses in that neighborhood? Talked a little bit about the Indigenous communities members and what should it look like from that standpoint. You know, and how do we get folks from those different groups engaged in this process so that they feel like they're a part of it? You know, what type of community events would include people from other different cultures and that need to be voicing their concerns. Talked about, yeah, the community engagement, you know, and I think there's meetings coming up, it sounds like, so, you know, to get the word out to enough people. And then a timeline as far as what the timeline would be for this project. Are we on a rush to get this to happen, or can we take time to get enough voices, enough people together to give their input? And then we talked a little bit about the city council and how they work with we couldn't answer this question, how they work with the Port Authority, who kind of is in charge of the project. It's the port owns the land, but what does the city council do? And that, I think, is something that needs to be clarified for us as to how those two groups work together. So I think that's it, unless other people in our group had other comments that they wanted to add.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Only Ben, just real quick, sorry, I couldn't get back to my thing. But we also, we talked about, you know, is it feasible? How feasible or realistic is it for the powers that be to extend, you know, this engagement timeline in an effort to get real, you know, authentic voices representing the many communities to the table, you know, if that was feasible.
Thanks, Cian. How about group 4?
I think, who is gonna do our presentation? Oh, Ethan. Not just before Ethan starts, I just want to say that Patricia let us know and let me know specifically that it's not too late to put pressure on this. So I stand corrected and ready to put the pressure on this Hillcrest site. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely don't think it's too late to put pressure on. So the conversation in our room really centered around the legacy of history in St. Paul in terms of racial and economic justice or injustice and the effects of that on a development like this. That really dominated a lot of the conversation in our room, but there was also conversation about alternative types of energy and how that plays into affordability. There was talk about, climate change issues and how Hillcrest can be used either to mitigate those issues or to exacerbate them. And I think there was just a general theme that we don't want to miss out, someone said, on another opportunity for the East Side to get a really good development that doesn't have adverse effects. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to that, but.
Well, I think we did talk about how for people on a limited income, that energy costs are the second highest and take a disproportionate percentage of their budget than for other people, frankly. And so that things like cooperative community solar, where the community owns the energy and are not buying it from Excel, is even more important if you're in a lower income group. And if you want to make this a truly equitable development, that you have to incorporate that along with the things which I think, I'm sorry, what was it Linda said about, having larger apartments units, of 3 bedrooms, because in her work, she was constantly seeing that was what was needed.
We talked too just a bit about labor and unions and wanting to have businesses own construction work by people of color, and that there's not as much overlap there as you might hope. Some thought about talking about that with Peter too.
So I see a note from Jane in the chat, but I also want to make sure that group 5 has a chance to share back.
I think that we were group 5.
Are we group 5?
That
Okay.
Jean presented. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay, was there anyone in any groups that didn't have a chance to share back?
I think we skipped group 3.
Okay, we got 4 and 3 mixed. Go ahead.
Okay.
So you want me to go?
Sure.
And others, please jump in. I took some notes, and we got into conversation so quickly we didn't identify a formal spokesperson, but I did take some notes. We were very interested in the what would happen with reparations, and especially appreciating that bringing that perspective into the process early was very important, and could really shape the project in some very exciting ways. But we did have a lot of questions about how that would proceed at the city level. We, as others have, we were very concerned to make sure engagement drew across the full demographics, and that hasn't been happening as much as we might all like. We talked a bit about the pollution and how disheartening it was to see the extent of how the land had been used, expecting that it will be remediated appropriately. But there was an example of the Upper Harbor project in Minneapolis that the city really held off on some of the environmental issues, and there was discussion here that we wanted to make sure those were addressed fully from the beginning. The removal of all the trees was also unfortunate. Is there any way that some of those could be saved? There was some discussion about an economic village rather than silos of, affordable buildings and then market rate buildings. Is there any way to create more of a cross section and a village concept? And then we talked about affordability, that we don't really know how to define that in a way that does justice to the concept, that everything is affordable to someone, but how do we really try to look at that a little differently, maybe encouraging developers to come at this with a different lens, some innovative concepts that we might explore with developers. And others want to jump in if I miss something.
Hi, this is LaShella Sims. You covered everything, but as we were, I explained to the group that I'm from North Minneapolis. I don't know how the invitation arrived on my desk, but I accepted it, and so that's how I'm here. I'm also connected with the Upper Harbor Terminal and all that encompasses in North Minneapolis. I am also a member of the environmental justice group of the Minnesota Pollution Control, and we're based on the executive order of President Clinton of 1994, 12898. And as we were talking, one of the things that occurred to me, because something seems so similar that's going on there that happened here on this side, and I wondered if any, because of the way the community had to literally push our city council to, number one, make it more, to stop and make it more public and give the general public, general communities time to learn about this and what was going on. And then we had to push and actually take them to court regarding them not making any major decisions until an environment assessment was done. And a thought occurred to me as I'm listening to you all speak: has any exclusive rights to developers been made? One was made that surfaced it when we were at that route of making the city council stop. So I was wondering, has behind the scenes any exclusive rights to developers been made that you all may not be aware of?
Maybe Anne has an answer or some comments on that. Anne DeJoy.
Well, I would say if not, maybe that was something that that would be, to your advantage to find out.
We can certainly talk more about that. James saying in the chat, not to her knowledge. Let's do this. I'm going to share my screen one more time so you can see these next two dates. I want to stress the importance of attending the city's meeting next week, as well as our follow-up. In the meantime, as I'm sharing, why don't you drop in the chat some ideas for the meeting on the 23rd, so that we can design kind of a structure of an event where we have a chance to talk about some of these questions.
Also, I'd just like to add, with the Ford project, they had a rowdy group of people on the opposite side out there in Highland who were opposing that, and I'm not saying we should take their approach, but it just they were very vocal about their opposition to the Ford site, and I think that's why there was a lot of attention around it. So might want to revisit just some of the things that they were doing. I wouldn't do it the same way, but just look at how they were able to garner some attention around that.
Thanks, Traherne. So just one more. The city is holding a public engagement session next week on Tuesday, the 16th from 5:30 to 7. I'm going to send all this information out in an email. I have your emails from registering for the event, so I'll be sending out information about that. We're also going to host a follow-up conversation to tonight's conversation on Tuesday, the 23rd from 6:30 to 8. Please try to attend that as well. You know, I often say this, but it is crucial to invite your neighbors to these conversations, especially those who are underrepresented in this type of process. So please, 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 please invite your neighbors to these conversations so that we can bring more voices into these processes. With that, I just want to thank everyone. If you want to stick around, Jane, I'll give you a chance to talk about TIF, but we also could talk about it at the next meeting as well. TIF is kind of a complicated process, and it might need its own event all of it in and of itself. You want to talk about it now, or do you want to talk about it later, Jane?
No, I'm happy to get into it later. The one thing I'll say is that when the city approved funding for the Port Authority to buy the site, the city asked the Port Authority to agree that it would not use tax increment financing. And tax increment financing, as many of us know, is a tremendous financing tool that should be able to be used on the east side, where investment has been less than it has been in the rest of the city. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to talk about it at the next session. But my own feeling is that we need to look at that elimination of a financing tool for the east side by the city that could be an extremely important one for us to use in creating affordable housing. So I'll leave it at that. I'll leave us with a cliffhanger for the next meeting.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Jane. Brad, I just saw your question in the chat there. You know, our West Side community organization right here in St. Paul is successfully using the Equitable Development Scorecard in their developments. I've been learning more about that process, and it's happening right here in our backyard. Okay, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I look forward to seeing you soon. Expect some resources from Traherne and me. I'm going to follow up with the presentation that was given tonight. I'm going to follow up with the dates and a flyer for that next meeting. And Traherne is going to include some of the resources that we talked about. Traherne, you want to say anything else before we end?
I'd like to thank you guys all for attending this great meeting. And then next month for our book club meeting, we're going to have Dr. Uhuru Williams. Yep, Dr. Uhuru Williams. He works with Peter.
Uhuru Williams.
He's a professor from St. Thomas, and he's doing a lot of great work there. And we're looking forward to working with him on this this reparations push for the city of St. Paul. So that'll be our next book club meeting. We're really excited about that. And just thank you guys all for coming out, and be looking out for more information about upcoming events around this. And also our the Legislative Advisory Committee applications will be out, I believe, the first week of April. So if you guys know anybody who's interested in sitting on the Legislative Advisory Committee, or you want us to come talk to your organization or a group of people about the process, please reach out to Jane, Nelsie, myself, and anybody else you could think of.
Brad asked in the chat, when is the next book club meeting for her?
That would be April, this second week in April?
Second Tuesday.
Second Tuesday in April.
Fantastic. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful night, and thanks for spending some time with us.
Peace.
Peace.
Bye.
Peace.